Well, thank you, and good afternoon. Our aim this afternoon, over about the next 40 minutes or so, is to give you a short presentation on some observations and insights from Operation Inherent Resolve. We'll try and tie it back, following the Secretary's comments this morning, to the National Defence Strategy, as well as the Army Vision. And as I speak, I'm very conscious that there are a number of people here in the conference, some people here in this audience who know a lot more about Iraq and Syria than I do, not least my boss, General Funk, standing over on the left there. Before I start, let me just introduce who you're looking at. My name is Felix Gedney. As you heard, I was the Deputy Commander for Strategy and Support for Operation Inherent Resolve for the last 13 months or so. Came back about a month ago. General Ladebek was our Director of Intelligence during most of that year. And Mr. Mark Stroh from the Department of State headed up the Department of State's stabilization efforts in northeast Syria. We're going to hear much more about that, and that's particularly important. So, drawing it back to the Army Vision and the NDS for the first point. The NDS talks about a joint force, allies and partners. A joint force combined with a robust constellation of allies and partners is the exact quote. And here you have it, with Leah representing the joint force, Mark and I that robust constellation. And it's not a coincidence that there are no US military up here briefing you. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a quick recap through our year in Iraq and Syria. I'm going to make that reasonably quick because I want to get into 4 areas where we'd like to talk about this afternoon. Those are complexity, unmanned air systems, information, and stabilization. And none of this should be earth-shattering insights or revelations. All of what we say has been presaged for many years in our doctrine and our theory. I would say that we will be able to give you an insight into the operationalizing of that theory and making it real. So next slide, please. So to quickly recap then, the operational approach for Operation Inherent Resolve was based on 3 tenets. First of all, the liberation of terrain, followed by the securing of that terrain to consolidate those gains, and then the stabilization of those liberated areas. And this was conducted by, with, and through partner forces, locally raised partner forces. The past year has seen remarkable success in Iraq and Syria in liberating terrain from ISIS. In Iraq, following the fall of Mosul, we saw a rapid and aggressive Iraqi security force maneuver operations and major combat operations throughout Iraq, moving through Tal Afar, the area of Hawija, and then clearing through Anbar, at times challenging our ability to keep up with that pace of liberation. Indeed, by the end of last year, when the Prime Minister of Iraq announced the liberation of Iraq, we believe we were some 8.5 months ahead of our campaign schedule of where we thought we'd be. We thought we would be clearing Anbar after the Iraqi elections. And in Syria, Raqqa city was liberated by the Syrian Democratic Forces, a mixed force of locally raised Arabs and Kurds. And that was a particularly fierce urban fight. And following that, the SDF advanced into the mainly Arab areas on the east of the Euphrates, down in the middle Euphrates River Valley, to liberate them. And as I brief you now, the last stage of that liberation fight in the area of Hajin, down at the bottom, the southern end of the middle Euphrates River Valley in Syria, is still ongoing. So the by, with, and through approach, we would argue, was a success, but it did not come without significant sacrifice. And it's important to me that I remind you that those liberation battles resulted in the death and injury of thousands of our partner force, as well as some of our own coalition forces. Next slide, please. But the liberation is only the first stage of that operational approach that I articulated. The liberated areas must be secured in order to hold the terrain and reduce the risk of an ISIS insurgency. In Iraq, this is being done by continuing the effort of training and equipping Iraqi security forces. During our year, our partner force development effort switched from a process which was generating combat power at pace in order to throw it into the liberation fight to a much more nuanced effort of building security structures and developing the security institutions that will be capable of maintaining the security of Iraq in future. And in Syria, local security forces are being developed in order to hold the areas that have been liberated east of the Euphrates River. Next slide, please. And the final part of the operational approach, which we'll discuss in more detail, it was one of our lessons, was the stabilization of those areas. Stabilization is not humanitarian aid, which is focused on preserving life, nor is it reconstruction to rebuild the state's infrastructure. It's the provision of sufficient essential services and governance to provide hope for the population that their best future lies without ISIS. It's what Major General Pyatt, who may be here in the audience, is certainly at the conference, who was the commander in the Combined Joint Force Land Component, termed winning the peace. Alternatively, you could call it winning the people. And the stabilization, as we'll argue later, is now critical to campaign success in Iraq and Syria. So, next slide, please. Let's start with the first of our four areas that I'd like to go into, and that is complexity. It was discussed a little bit in the opening of the conference today. On the face of it, the mission of Operation Inherent Resolve is pretty straightforward. It was to defeat ISIS in Iraq and Syria. But the reality of achieving that is very different. And at this point, I'd like to hand over to Brigadier General Ladebek to give an idea of certainly the enemy situation, the situation we were dealing with in theatre. There, over to you.
Okay, I'll try this one. Thank you. So I guess what I'd like to start off with, because you have probably all are very well versed in the ISIS fight and what was the characterization of that enemy. So I don't necessarily want to go into ISIS. What I would like to say over the last year was, and I was there from June of 2017 to this past June, is more so what the complexity was by the regional actors and not by ISIS itself. ISIS was difficult enough to defeat on its own using by, with, and through our partners. However, the challenge was very much switched, I will say, or much accelerated with the regional actors. And that's primarily, I would say, because ISIS was a common enemy that we had for a couple of years. When we started to see the near defeat of ISIS, and in Iraq, when the Prime Minister declared victory in December of last year, and then in Syria, you could see ISIS, I mean, they were on their last legs, and we knew that they were going to be defeated. Russia also knew they would be defeated, Syria knew they would be defeated, etc. And the regional players then, once we lost that commonality of an enemy, then the objectives started to really diverge. And we had, with Russia, I would say great power competition was an objective by Russia. They saw us as a peer, and they wanted to to take advantage in any way that they could. And they used all instruments of DIME, of the national power, diplomatic, informational, military, and economic. And I would say one of the main objectives that Russia had, not only to compete with us, but also was economically, they wanted to seize especially oil fields, if you might have heard. They wanted bids and contracts to develop infrastructure for Syria in order to stabilize Syria over the long term. Syria, of course, had their own objectives, and that was primarily to overthrow opposition. It wasn't necessarily to overthrow ISIS, but that was a good bonus for them as well. And then, of course, you had Iran in the mix and wanting to develop their regional objectives that might get in the way with our objectives, might get in the way with the Russians and with the Syrians. And so it was extremely complex to have all of these regional partners, and primarily working in Syria. On the Iraq side, and I think I just said regional partners, let me step back, but these regional actors, primarily in Syria. But on the Iraq side, also difficulties and challenges, and primarily with sectarian divide, as we've seen in previous years. Also, a very strong Iranian influence that still today is something, and I'm certain in the NDS as well, will be something that we will address at some point. And I think I'll just leave it at that and take some questions at the end.
Thanks, Claire. Let me just sum that up a little bit. We fought in a large coalition, many of whom had competing agendas, in a very contested region where there are fractured Iraqi politics, sectarian divides, working with a non-state actor in Syria in the middle of a vicious civil war, where tribal dynamics and Kurd Arab relationships needed to be managed, operating by, with, and through a partner force in Syria that at least one member of our coalition fundamentally disagreed with our use of that force and thought them as a national security risk. We managed a deconfliction with Russia while simultaneously deterring Russia and other pro-regime forces from offensive action against the coalition. Not always succeeding either. In a very challenging humanitarian situation, particularly in Syria. And all of this within an exceptionally aggressive information domain. Now, the NDS recognizes the increasing complex global security environment. And the Army vision talks about joint, multi-domain, high-intensity conflict being conducted, simultaneously deterring and conducting irregular warfare. There it is, right there, for the last year in Iraq and Syria, and continuing. What does this mean for the Army? Well, it means the Army has to be able to manage this complexity, develop expert understanding and situational awareness. Our common operating picture has to do more than just look at our enemies. We have to be able to track political and geostrategic issues. We have to be able to see exactly what's happening in the electromagnetic spectrum. We have to be able to track the information environment at every level, from strategic down to tactical. We have to be able to see and understand the popular perceptions. We have to see the movements of our adversaries as well as our enemies. And we have to understand the issues and agendas within our allies, while all of the time not losing sight of our assigned mission to defeat the enemy. And that's no small task. Moving on, the second thing I'd like to talk about is unmanned air systems. And again, I'm going to turn to Leah to talk about this initially. Next slide, please. Leah, over to you.
Yeah, so I think the technology, of course, is something that we are all, in every battle and every day, we are trying to take advantage of. We, as well as the enemy. So I know that you've probably heard of the unmanned aerial systems, the drones, essentially, that ISIS was using in more of an asymmetric manner than what we have actually seen before. In a couple of examples, they were very good at it. And I'll tell you a couple of examples in Deir ez-Zor, for instance, when the Russians and the Syrians had pushed the ISIS out of Deir ez-Zor, they actually set up in one of the they set up their depot, weapons depot. That's what you guys would call it. They set up a weapons depot in one of the stadiums in Deir ez-Zor. And ISIS, even though they had been liberated or not liberated, but defeated in Daz, there were still a number of ISIS insurgents roaming around. And they attacked in a complex attack with a number of systems, drones. If I remember correctly, the number is about 6 or 7. And they filmed it, of course, and they all they had to do was drop a couple of grenades into the weapons depot and destroyed the entire depot. They did another attack on January 1st, or it was December 31st of this last year, and that was also against the Russians up in Bala Assad airfield at BAA, in which case they actually destroyed and damaged a number of aircraft, Russian aircraft, as well as killed a number of soldiers there. So we saw UASs being used by ISIS, but also more of the high end, of course, that the Iranians would fly, the Syrians would fly, and so that airspace became and would become extremely congested because there was no way really to deconflict with there was no way for us to deconflict with the Iranians, but we could deconflict through the Russians with the Syrians and the Russians. However, this is just another example of a technology that we will see probably in every campaign, whether it's high-end by some of our near-peer competitors or if it's on the low-end side by insurgents such as ISIS.
Thanks, Leah. The National Defense Strategy recognizes that new commercial technology will change society and ultimately the character of war. The Army Vision talks about the accelerating pace of technological change will create challenges and opportunities for the Army's battlefield superiority. We will never deploy again to a theatre of operations where we are not under threat from unmanned air systems, both those high-end systems of our near-peer competitors and adversaries, and lower commercial off-the-shelf bodged together systems that are developed by asymmetric enemies. And we need to get used to that. The UAS threat is now a technological race between the unmanned air system and the counter system, just like we've seen in armor, anti-armor in past years. And again, we need to win that race. Next slide, please. Next thing I'd like to talk about is information. No one here at AUSA, and certainly no one that heard the Secretary's comments this morning, should be in any doubt about the importance of the multi-domain battle. The information domain is a critical part of that multi-domain battle, and I would argue possibly the critical domain. I am not an information operations expert, but I know a fight when I see one, and that's exactly what we deployed into in Iraq and Syria. The scale of the information activity that was going on around Operation Inherent Resolve last year, I believe, was unprecedented. We saw ISIS propaganda broadcast globally as well as locally, although we did quite a bit to minimize that over the year with Iran previously. We saw an extremely aggressive Russian and Syrian regime information operation. And I draw your attention to the picture on the left of that slide there. The Russians are really good at this, better than us. That picture was put out in open source on Twitter or Facebook or something like that. And you'll see a picture of some Russian soldiers, carefully placed pictures of Putin and Bashar al-Assad. You'll see humanitarian aid, telling the story in a picture in a way that we're not doing yet. we're finding pictures and we're putting them out, but actually this is staged, even down to the fact that, as you'll see, the badge that they've developed for their humanitarian operation is in Russian and it's in English, to make sure that that message comes across loud and clear to anyone who sees that from their adversaries. We saw the situation on the ground being wildly distorted and misrepresented in order to achieve information effect. We saw military operations being conducted for the sole reason of getting the picture or the footage that those people wanted. And at times that was good because it meant we didn't see escalation. But it was very clear. And at times in this city, pictures were arriving in this city faster than we were seeing them in the operational headquarters in Baghdad. And we saw a very clever, I would say insidious, information campaign aimed at discrediting the campaign of the coalition. And again, I would argue that in many of our nation's capitals, we didn't realize we were being played. And in the information domain, our freedom to operate is often constrained, rightly, by higher level strategic issues. But the impact of that, certainly during my time in Operation Inherent Resolve, was to leave a gaping vacuum in terms of the narrative that made it easy for our adversaries to fill it with theirs. And I'm very happy to go into more detail on that if required in questions. Within the CJTF headquarters, we worked hard to operationalize the information fight and make the multi-domain operations real. But don't underestimate how difficult that process is. Some of our information tools, particularly when it comes to public information, are in effect a global area weapon and have to be used very carefully. Conceptualizing this, particularly for warfighters that are used to kinetic activity, can be really difficult. And articulating the freedoms and enabling mission command when it comes to the information domain is also really problematic. Our approach was to simplify, go back to basic military principles, and in my case I referred to NATO Information Doctrine, which is mirrored in UK's Information Activity Doctrine. It works. And make sure that we drew everything back to the simple military principles. We applied a principle of concentration of force. At any one time, we dealt with 3 themes that we were trying to progress. And we made sure that those were agreed by the commanding general. We didn't change them too often, but they were the things we wanted to achieve traction on at any one time. We made sure that it was dealt with by the way that we all understand in the military. The planner's plan. The 35 folk refine and synchronize, and the CJ3 executes. This is not a battle that can be fought by the Public Affairs Office writing lines to take. That's where we walked into this. We had a fantastic Public Affairs Office, brilliant. But asking them to do the lines to take is a bit like asking the gun line to decide where they're going to fire the artillery. Doesn't make sense. It's got to be operationalized down into a genuine multi-domain battle. And for any priority, we provided a simple commander's intent, which was a 1-paragraph articulation of how we were going to maneuver through the information space. Those of you wearing uniform will be very aware of how powerful that is when we do ground or air maneuver. Take exactly the same approach. That allows anyone within the CJTF who knows that intent, knows what their authorities are, and understands in depth their part of the battle to exercise initiative and fight the fight. Next slide, please. So the last part of the campaign I want to talk about is stabilization. The campaign, as I said, will not now be won by the military. We all know the need for a whole-of-government approach. We talk about multi-domain operations. We've had unified action, integrated action, comprehensive approach, latest UK doctrines, fusion doctrine. We've been saying it for many years. The reality is very different. And operationalizing this, I would argue, is some way behind our theoretical understanding of what has to be done. Many of our civilian partners, present company accepted, don't agree with the way the military should get involved in this. And often the military make it really, really difficult for our civilian partners to work with us. We struggle to gain a common view of the situation. And we have to do better. Because unless we can work jointly on this, we will fail in our campaigns. And we will fail in Iraq and Syria unless we can genuinely find a whole-of-government approach. Now, I'm pleased to say that it gets easier the closer you get to the point of delivery. The closer you get to the front line, the people who are operating, from the NGOs, the State Department, the military, find it easier to get along. And in which case I'm going to hand over to Mark, because Mark has been right at the front line of this for the last 12 months, opting to stay for 12 months rather than 6 because he wanted to make sure we had continuity. And I'm really delighted, Mark, that you're here to give your perceptions of how we did this in Northeast Syria. Mark.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. Just want to say thanks to General Gedney for the invitation to participate in this panel. It's a real honor, and I think that there's a valuable lesson learned just in the fact that the three of us are standing up here together to speak about this. What I'd like to do briefly is say a word about what our civilian laydown was in northeastern Syria. I think there's some lessons to be learned there at the execution, but also conception level of how that came about, and how our laydown in northeastern Syria on the civilian side cooperated with, worked hand in glove with, and executed the same exact mission as our military partners, which is, as on the civilian side, as on the military side, the enduring and lasting defeat of ISIS, and to set the conditions in northeastern Syria so that neither ISIS 2.0 or any other violent extremist organization can ever come back and find fertile ground in those liberated areas. So our operation, which is the only place in the world, has been and is currently, where a civilian team of Department of State and USAID officials are deployed and co-located with Special Operations Forces in an active combat zone in a country with which we do not have a chief of mission, we do not have an embassy, we do not have diplomatic relations, began as an outcome of a tabletop exercise about 2 years ago related to planning after the liberation of Manbij, which was obviously the first major city that we liberated in the Northeast with our SDF partner force. So the outcome of that conference was that the military planners asked state if they could provide civilians, both from the Department of State and USAID, to embed with the military on the ground to better shape the military's post-conflict stabilization operations, but also to better direct our own civilian assistance programs. Even though we closed our embassy and severed our relations with Syria in 2012, we maintain a robust platform of humanitarian assistance and stabilization programs directed into the entire country of Syria, primarily through our offices in an embassy in Turkey and also Jordan. But to have people on the ground to manage that assistance, to manage those programs, to work in concert with the military was a request from the Pentagon that the State Department absolutely thought was a good idea. That was about 2 years ago. And that idea did not actually gain approval from the Department of State until March of 2017. We obviously had a change of administration, new leadership at the State Department and the Department of Defense. But the fact is that the political will at both the highest levels of DoD and state to deploy those civilians and that capability in concert with Special Operations Forces was critical and remains critical to the execution of the civilian piece of this mission. Secondarily, once we actually were able to get there, which took a lot more time, and the lesson there is that even with command decision and the imperative from the top to do this, it's really, really difficult and takes a lot of time. So approval in March, first civilians on the ground in about June, and I arrived to be permanently deployed to Syria in the first week of October 2017. But we were initially authorized a small team That team was increased in size at the authorization of Secretary Tillerson and the request of the DoD in December of 2017. And just this past week, the size of that complement of civilians has once again been increased. In fact, it's been doubled on the authorization of our current Secretary, Secretary Pompeo. So what does having civilians deployed with the military in a setting like this help us do better? Well, number one, General Gedney spoke about the common operating picture that is required to inform the campaign. There are a diversity of actors that are operating in a place like northeastern Syria that don't want to have anything to do with the military. There are INGOs, there are community-based organizations. We have relationships with these organizations, and we are better able and better positioned, co-located in northeastern Syria, to share that information and to better inform that common operating picture that General Gedney mentioned. Secondarily, it will be no secret to anyone in this room, the State Department doesn't have a conference like this. We don't have anything like all the things you see around these rooms. There is always going to be an imbalance in resources between what the DoD can bring to the table and what the State Department is going to bring to the table, even in a setting that is more akin to a civilian effort like a stabilization setting. So with us on the ground, we can work hand in glove with our military colleagues to make sure that even though there is an imbalance of resources as far as what's DoD money, what's DoD resources, we can work together to target all of our resources, all of our tools, where they are best deployed to advance the stabilization effort. What I'm going to not do is talk in detail about stabilization and kind of the efforts we made at the tactical level. We can do that in the Q&A. But I think the last thing that I would like to say before I turn it back over to General Gedney is that having state and USAID and civilian and military co-located in this way, talking directly, participating from my side in commanders' briefs, being able to reach out to or be contacted by not just the battlefield commanders in Syria, but the leadership at the Special Operations Joint Task Force, the Combined Joint Task Force for OIR, I think enabled a unity of effort as we move from kinetic to stabilization operations that was able to occur in real time on the ground in obviously an incredibly complex, incredibly fast-moving environment in a way that is better probably than anywhere else in the world. And I do think that the lessons there are many, but primarily it comes back down to common operating picture, communication, and working together jointly on a unified effort. And maybe I'll leave it there, sir, and turn it back to you.
Thanks, Mark. So in conclusion, we picked just 4 areas: complexity, UAS, info, stabilization. There are many more, but not enough time. What does all this tell us for the Army? Well, it largely reinforces what we already know. It certainly reinforces what the National Defense Strategy and the Army vision tells us. And I would argue very strongly that that vision isn't a vision of the future, it's here right now. And it's exactly what we saw last year in OIR. It tells us the Army has to develop leaders who can manage complexity, who can understand the strategic implications of military action, but at the same time not lose sight of what ultimately should be a relatively simple mission: to defeat the enemy. It means we need leaders that conceptualize the multi-domain battle and at the same time bring simplicity to how it is operationalized. And we need leaders that can cooperate with the Joint Force, with partners, indigenous forces, local governments, and have the interpersonal skills to make that work. And finally, it tells us, certainly tells me, that most of our doctrine is actually pretty good. We need leaders that can read it and apply it and make it real. Thank you very much for listening. I think we've got about 5 minutes or so for questions, and afterwards we'll go decide if anyone wants anything more after that. We're very happy to take your questions offline as well. Well, good. Ma'am?
Testing. Thank you all very much for what your discussion on this is enlightening and and the challenge of the environment, I'm sure, is unbelievable. So you talked about a common operating picture. We've been struggling with this in industry as in the military as well. What tools were you given that helped you provide that kind of situation awareness? Was it an intel sources or operational things? So how did you fuse all this information into a MDO structure?
I guess I would say at the JTF we had a, and I'm sorry I could not tell you the tool that we used, but it was not. I will say it was definitely not automated. Right, this is where we are putting so much time and effort by soldiers and sailors and airmen who are on the ops floor, who are gathering data from intelligence sources for sure, at multi-domain, across, up at the high side, at a secret level and at an unclassified level, and we are. As well as on the operational side, so that ops floor at the JTF is gathering data from all of the components. And unfortunately, in a case like this, I think we showed that we did not have the right tools. We don't have the right automation by any means. Because each of our components comes in with something different. Our special operators come with something different than our conventional Army forces come with something. The air component also had its own COP. And then, of course, from an enemy standpoint, the intelligence folks, it's extremely manual and fairly challenging to make sure that the commander, the CHOPS, who's on the ops floor, and then the J3, who is trying to execute, that we're getting them the right amount or the most accurate and relevant data as quickly as possible. I guess I'd also like to say one thing I learned from an ISR perspective, an intelligence perspective. This is the first time, or not the first time, to use social media, publicly available information, open source intelligence. But this is the first time I saw the complexity or the amount of PAI that is out there in the battlefield. And I think that is something it will continue to robust in any battle space where we might be. And so we, as an intelligence field across the services, but also as from an ops perspective, we just have to figure out a way to gather all of that data and again make it relevant, make it actionable to the commander and to the J3.
Thanks, Len. And I'd add, of course, as it comes to that multi-domain picture that you're trying to build, when you're talking about the information environment, particularly when you're into open source, we need to be very careful about being spoofed, because that's the playground that our adversaries are spoofing us, sending false narratives, and we need to be very careful. And when it comes to the picture of the stabilization picture, we need to be very careful about not using too much military terminology. It took us 9 months to get to a picture in Iraq that we could share between us and UNDP, that we both had the same picture of where the priorities were and what was going on. And one of the secrets to success was not to call it a common operating picture. Stabilization snapshot is what we end up coming up with, something that doesn't sound too military, that turns all our civilian colleagues off. Okay, well, thank you very much for listening. I appreciate it.